this is a big story that is developing. I reported this for Transfermarkt late last week on Saturday, that Gio Reyna has now a new agent, and that's now also entered on Transfermarkt as the side, right? He's left Wasserman. The Wasserman departure was reported early in December, right? Although it was not made official until he did join a new agency. And that new agent is Jorge Mendes and Gestifood. He is one of the biggest agents there is. He represents pretty much every Portuguese star. Long-time agent for Cristiano Ronaldo as well, right? Has a lot of links in Portugal and Spain. Obviously, with 2 Premier League clubs as well, Nottingham Forest and Wanderers, where Wolves is the one, I think, where he has, he pretty much has a stake in that club, if I'm not mistaken. So obviously, not surprising that Gio Reyna, quickly after changing agents, is being linked to a transfer to all sorts of clubs. Real Sociedad were the big one that we're interested in. I want to touch on that in a moment, because I think that is really important here, because there has been some movements in that front as well. But Stefan, Gio Reyna, the reporting aside that he's now with a new agent, that he now wants to leave Borussia Dortmund. I think anyone who's seen him play against Darmstadt, the body language has made it clear that he wants to go. I've been told by sources that I trust that the Reyna family may push for a transfer away from Borussia Dortmund. Whether Borussia Dortmund play ball is a completely different question, because they will want to see a significant transfer fee here. But I feel like the writing has been on the wall for quite some time here.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to put it, to be honest. The writing has been on the wall for a long time. We get constant questions from people who don't really follow the Bundesliga, wondering why Gio Reyna isn't playing, why is he not starting. I think Chelsea fans used to get the same from US-based fans about Christian Pulisic when he was sitting on the bench, or even not in the team itself. Obviously, he, alongside Pulisic, kind of garners the hopes of a lot of kind of US soccer fans, internationally, of course. And if, just like any nation, really, they'll be wondering why their youngest and brightest aren't getting game time. And, it's a multifaceted problem for Reyna at Dortmund. It goes back a number of seasons, past a number of head coaches. And unfortunately, I think it's just kind of been something that's just been kind of, just kind of been diminishing or just being ground down into dust over the years. He's obviously had a number of injuries. I think that's where you have to start first and foremost, which have got in the way of his development. But not just his development, I think they've also got in the way of his standing in this Dortmund team. And, I think if you had to kind of cut a long story short, you would probably say that maybe I don't say maybe, actually. I think undoubtedly there were kind of hopes at Dortmund that he would go on to become the next big star, the next Pulisic, the next Sancho, the next Jude Bellingham, even though Bellingham came after him, of course. But year after year, injury got in the way of that. And I think, Dortmund obviously got to a point where they said, look, we simply can't rely on this kid anymore. We have to move on. We have to bring in players that can play regularly. And, you only have to look at Edin Terzic's squad to see that, there's now a huge amount of competition, and there's a number of players who are in front of Reyna in that team. In terms of this season, Adeyemi and Daniel Malin are the 2 most high-profile wide players who've been signed to play directly in Gio Reyna's position. If you want to suggest that Reyna was maybe better as a number 10, that's fine, but then he has to kind of knock Marco Reus and Julian Brandt out of the position. And then, of course, in the last couple of weeks, Jadon Sancho's returned to the club, and it wouldn't surprise me if that's had a very direct impact on where Gio Reyna maybe sees his future, at least this month or in the summer, because it's another big profile player who is going in and slotted above Reyna in the pecking order. And look, it doesn't feel to me like it's really anyone's fault. I know there'll be a lot of people who will be listening or watching this who maybe have the context of Reyna's behaviour, shall we say, with the US men's national team and all that chaos. They might have that as their context and think, okay, maybe we've got this kid who's been misbehaving or has not been training hard enough or has fallen out with his head coach at Dortmund. I don't really think there's anything I don't think for starters, no reporting there, so I'm not even going to suggest there's anything to it, but I don't think it's anything like that at Dortmund. I think it's just a simple case of a young, talented player who's been held back by injuries. And Dortmund, perhaps more than any other club, constantly churning these young players out, developing them, moving them on. And if you don't develop and you don't get moved on at Dortmund, you end up just kind of being part of the furniture and kind of, disappeared into the background, really. And that's kind of what's happened with Reyna. And is probably why he does have to move on and find a club that can give him game time, assuming he can stay fit next season.
Yeah, obviously, just to add to this a little bit from what you said, or put some context into it, I think at Borussia Dortmund, there's always been this understanding that Gio Reyna would one day replace Marco Reus as that attacking midfielder in the middle of the park, right? And then, of course, when you look at some of the stats that he has, the underlying stats, they're actually better than Marco Reus and Julian Brandt. Of course, it's easier to get those kind of stats or get those higher numbers when you have limited playing time, and you do it against opponents that are already being tired out, because Dortmund are often the team that is on the forefront, especially in the Bundesliga, right? So, it isn't like there weren't any opportunities given to him. And I think this is where maybe there's a little bit of frustration within the Borussia Dortmund camp, that they protected him when there was trouble with the US men's national team. In fact, they came out publicly and said, look, we don't understand what's going on here. When he's with us, he's always on his best behavior. He behaves well in the dressing room. He has good chemistry with his teammates. We don't understand why it's so different with the US men's national team. And I think from what I've been told, there's a little bit of frustration now that they did all of that only for Claudio Reyna essentially showing up at Sebastian Kehl's office and saying like, oh, we're changing agents. We're going to Jorge Mendes. We're going to say goodbye to Wasserman. And by the way, I'm going to take over as his personal agent within this structure, and we want to leave like right now in January. And I don't think that was even planned by the club at all, right? So I think there's a little bit of frustration there now that Dortmund feel they have protected the player for so very long, and they don't think that, although you can make a point that Edin Terzic can be criticized a little bit for his youth development. We've spoken about Yusuf Moukoko in great length. But, they also see that when Yusuf Moukoko comes on against Darmstadt, he right away scores a goal and he gives it all. And then, you look at Gio Reyna's body language and it's like, well, I don't even want to be here. And I think that's where a little bit of frustration is there.
Yeah. I mean, the only other thing I'd add to that, I think you've summed it up perfectly there, is like even on the pitch, if you just kind of look at how things have played out this season, this season's actually one of the few ones where he hasn't picked up a long-term injury. He was out at the start of the year with an issue with his fibula, I think, for the first 3 or 4 games. But he obviously came back from that. And you can understand where the player might think, right, this is the season I finally break into this team. But instead, I've mentioned Bino Gittin, not meant Adeyemi rather, and Daniel Malin. But instead of Gio Reyna kind of breaking into those wide positions, it's actually been Bino Gittins who's done that. And you then look at that number 10 position where Julian Brandt's obviously going from strength to strength, but also Marco Reus has kind of had this resurgence after giving up the captaincy and many people thinking he would leave in the summer. He's actually kind of rebounded and actually proved to be a really important player. Not to mention maybe someone like Felix Nemcha as well, who might grow in importance in that position too. So even putting aside his injury concerns over the last kind of couple of years, this was the year where he really had the opportunity to really break into that team, and he just hasn't done it. So it just feels to me like the best case scenario for all parties really here is that he does move on and find a club that can give him game time.
I think that's where the issue comes in now, right? Because there has been interest. Real Sociedad is the club that has been reported the most. And the thing is, though, Dortmund will want to have a sizable transfer fee. If they send him, if they sell him, the other option, of course, is this is what Real Sociedad has been proposing, is a loan with an option to buy. And I think Dortmund are really worried about that because they look at Alexander Isak and Merino, Merino still plays for Real Sociedad and yet in between step at Newcastle, of course. But both those players went on to become very expensive superstars, right, in their own rights. And Dortmund don't want to have a scenario where that's the case again, and then they lose out on a lot of money. So I think that's really a big issue here, that Dortmund really want to have control over the player. And if he does go on loan somewhere, that's well that they will receive a significant transfer fee at least. And I think that makes things a little difficult, which is why, for example, Real Sociedad, they have now moved on to a different target, it seems, in Geraldo Becker, which is our next story here, right? The Union Berlin forward. I think this is actually quite fascinating because Real Sociedad did